For the past 3 years, the Trump administration has been pushing back on gains for LGBTQ rights, mainly through new regulations and appointments. According to a policy brief from the Fenway Institute at Fenway Health, the changes represent lost ground and the reasons for concern are more pressing. To tell us about the brief is one of the authors, the senior policy analyst from the Institute, Tim Wang. Thank you very much for being with us, Tim.
Thank you, Chris.
Tim, when I sometimes read about all of these changes, I imagine this is happening out in some distant heartland and it doesn't really make much difference for people around here. But does it make difference here?
It does make a difference here. We like to think of Massachusetts as kind of this progressive, liberal haven, a very safe space for LGBTQ folks, and it's great that we have lots of state policies that make it that way. But when you have discriminatory policies that are coming from the federal government, from the very top structures of our country's government, that does trickle down even to places in Massachusetts. And it's really dangerous, especially in healthcare, but in other aspects as well. We've seen it in housing, we've seen it affecting immigrants, so that can affect everyone across this country, even in Massachusetts.
Now, you're talking primarily about a population. I'm sure if they went to Fenway Health, they would probably feel fairly comfortable, but with these new regulations, what if they can't get to Fenway Health? They have to go someplace else. Does that make much of a difference now?
It does. So we do a lot of research with folks in Massachusetts who live all across the state, and even here, folks still feel like they're being discriminated against in a lot of healthcare settings. So not every place is going to be, Fenway, or not every place is going to be trained in providing care for LGBTQ folks. So when you have, for example, the Trump administration trying to roll back non-discrimination provisions in the Affordable Care Act that protect LGBTQ folks, or finalizing rules that allow providers to refuse to provide care to people based on religious reasons, which could include refusing to care for LGBTQ folks if it's against their religion, that will make it discrimination all the more prevalent in healthcare, and that's already an overwhelming problem that we're seeing even in Massachusetts.
Well, of course, one test here is if people feel discouraged about seeking something that they need, that's a problem. You've done some surveys in that. What did you find? We
have. So we did a couple surveys with LGBTQ folks across the state. Here from Fenway Health, it was actually specifically with transgender folks. We were looking at that whole question about access to public accommodations, and we found that transgender folks experienced a lot of discrimination in public accommodations, which includes healthcare. And when they had experienced discrimination in healthcare, they were even less likely to come in for emergency necessary care as well as preventive care. So an experience of discrimination, or even just fear of discrimination in healthcare, can really act as a barrier to seeking the necessary medical care that we all need.
By the way, this is also being piled on top of other kinds of regulatory changes.
Right.
And if you're talking about, let's say, employment discrimination, so how has that changed?
Well, nothing has changed yet, but you may have heard that there are a couple of cases that are going to be heard by the Supreme Court that are all arguing whether sexual orientation and gender identity are protected classes in employment civil rights laws. So there are three separate cases, one with a transgender woman and then two with two gay men who feel that they were fired for their sexual orientation and gender identities. So the Supreme Court will be hearing those cases and deciding whether or not sexual orientation and gender identity are protected classes in our existing civil rights legislation, and the Trump administration has unfortunately written briefs to the Supreme Court arguing against that.
Well, of course, I think one of those cases involves someone who worked in a funeral home, if I'm not mistaken. So,
correct.
So if it comes down that you can be fired from the funeral home because they don't like what you're doing about your gender identity, I mean, what does that send to other people as a message?
Right. Well, I mean, I think we saw this a lot when gay marriage was first legalized in this country. We saw a bunch of bakeries saying, we're not going to bake a cake for you for that sort of wedding, or things like that. It really just sends the message that this kind of discrimination is okay, that's something that's legal in our country, that's something that people can do. So that's definitely not the message that we want to be sending. So we're hoping for a good decision from the Supreme Court, but we definitely also want to enforce that just because these rulings may come out, that doesn't mean that employers should be doing these things. Employers can still take the steps necessary to make sure that their workspaces are safe for LGBTQ folks.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Tim Wang from the Fenway Institute. Tim, what about the toll this has taken on people? It's been 3 years into the Trump administration. Is there anything you can say here about the damage that has been done up to this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think talking in the abstract sense, I think a lot of the rescinding of these rules, proposing new regulations that make discrimination more prevalent for LGBTQ folks, we know that that's going to have a negative impact on health outcomes based off of other studies that we've done, and as well as access to healthcare before, we know that ACA was really prevalent in increasing healthcare coverage for LGBTQ folks, and anything that would damage that would really hurt the new coverage that lots of folks gain from the ACA. But we're also seeing like tangible health outcomes now. I think especially now with our immigrant LGBTQ population. Unfortunately, you may have heard stories of some transgender immigrants who were detained in an ICE facility in New Mexico who ended up dying because of the unconscionable conditions that were caused in that facility. So a lot of these policies that Trump is proposing and enacting are having real life detrimental effects.
Chris, another thing is, I guess, also on a broad scale here, is housing discrimination. There are changes.
Right.
This is not just for people worried about sexual orientation or gender identity, but for a lot of other things too. And I guess the burden of proof is going to be more on them. Right.
Yeah, and that's a good point that a lot of these things that we talk about, especially in this report, are kind of geared towards gender identity and sexual orientation, just because that's what we specialize in at Fenway Health. But a lot of the regulations that we're talking about go beyond that. So, for example, the provisions about like religious refusal of care go for sexual orientation, gender identity, but also sex, also religious beliefs. So this can affect a lot of different minority populations, people struggling with homelessness. So it's really far-reaching and really often targeting the most vulnerable among us.
There's one area where it seems the Trump administration has made some progress, though, and that is around preventing and maybe treating HIV and AIDS.
So the Trump administration has actually enacted a new Ending the HIV epidemic, where they're hoping to end the domestic HIV epidemic by the year 2030. So they're pouring a bunch of new resources into research and prevention and outreach, which I think is really great, definitely something that's necessary and also something that's doable by 2030. On the flip side of that, as we've been talking about all these discriminatory policies that increase stigma against LGBTQ folks, we know that that's where the disproportionate burden of our HIV epidemic is in those populations. And if you're enacting policies that make it more difficult for those folks to seek healthcare, get HIV tests, get access to treatment, that will actually kind of undermine this initiative.
One other development your brief looks at is the creation of a commission by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. It's called not a commission on human rights, but a commission on unalienable rights. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but what do you think that means?
Yeah, it's kind of this ongoing trend of this academic jargon that kind of juxtaposes like natural human rights as opposed to like ad hoc or additional human rights. And the framing of this often is that, rights for LGBTQ folks are kind of like special or additional rights on top of the human rights that we are all born with. And in that way, they can kind of separate them and say, we don't need to have laws that protect LGBTQ folks from discrimination because that's kind of like an extra special right for this small subgroup of the population, rather than recognizing that LGBTQ folks are, of course, part of humankind and we all have the same human rights.
Now, of course, I'm thinking, here's another one of these pompous commissions that come out with something that everybody forgets about and it doesn't make any difference. Do you think it could be more than that?
Well, I mean, I think we all kind of went into this presidency maybe thinking of it that way in general. I think a lot of people saw Trump and they saw a reality TV star, someone who was in the business world, someone who had said a lot of pro-gay things in the past, actually, and thought, this administration is actually not going to be so bad towards LGBTQ folks. But over the past 3 years, as documented in our reports, it's just been a bunch of anti-LGBTQ action after anti-LGBTQ action. So I think that it's definitely dangerous to kind of underestimate what this administration will do, especially to play to their conservative base in an election year.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Wang from Fenway Institute. We'll have more news in just a moment.